the way to do this.
The commission will come to order, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for being here. I want to welcome all of you to our hearing on Georgia's parliamentary elections, which is now only 11 days away. The campaign has brought Georgia to a crossroads. It is the most crucial event in Georgian democracy since the Rose Revolution of 2003. At that time, everyone will recall, Georgians responded to a rigged election with a peaceful protest. It was a great moment in Georgian history, the first of the color revolutions. The Rose Revolution brought Mikhail Saakashvili, I've said it a million times, and his team of Western-oriented modernizers into office. Hopes were high in Georgia that Saakashvili strengthened the state and launched many reforms. Russia's 2008 invasion and occupation of the Georgian regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia failed to topple the president, and our country has strongly supported Georgian sovereignty. Vladimir Putin's invasion was yet another revelation of his cynical brutality. As an aside, I would note that I was in Georgia in the days following that invasion, working to effect the return of two girls, daughters of one of my constituents, and as it turned out, several other young people who were caught behind Russian lines. And I was deeply impressed by the courage and the determination that I encountered in every Georgian that I met. That brings us to the present moment. Only a year ago, President Saakashvili's ruling national movement seemed poised to easily win the October 2012 parliamentary election over a fragmented opposition. But in October of 2011, a man by the name of Ivanovich Ivili began to unite elements of the opposition into a new coalition that posed a serious challenge. Mr. Ivanovich-Vili is a multi-billionaire and thought to be a newcomer to politics, and though he was such a newcomer, he had vast resources. The government quickly stripped him of his citizenship, and the parliament passed campaign finance laws that limited the use of his assets. At the same time, the instruments of the state, budget, police, and security services began to be deployed against the party and its supporters, though to what extent is a matter of dispute. Consequently, the election campaign has raised very serious questions about Mikhail Saakashvili's reputation as a reformer. I'm sure we'll hear from our witnesses to what degree his government has institutionalized genuine democratic governance as opposed to the appearance of it. I don't mean to prejudge this question. It is a difficult one that our witnesses are outstandingly qualified to grapple with. But the main questions we'd like to hear our witnesses answer touch on the conduct of the campaign. Specifically, the opposition's charges that the Georgian state has targeted Ivanovich-Vili and his supporters through harassment, intimidation, beating, selective enforcement of the law, and violations of freedom of assembly and expression. If substantially true, that would be terribly sad. It would indicate that the Rose Revolution had gone bad. At the same time, Ivanovich-Vili and his coalition have been tarred as working on behalf of Russia. The Georgian government sometimes seems to paint the conflict not as one between two political parties, but between the Georgia state and its foreign enemies trying to subvert it. We certainly need to hear your thoughts on that as well. I do believe that members of this commission will have open minds on all of these questions, and that each of your testimonies will be an important aspect in informing Congress and our own government on the conduct of the Georgian election campaign now in its last days. We are fortunate to have some outstanding witnesses who will speak to this, but before doing so, I'd like to now yield to my friend and colleague, Mr. Cohen, ranking member, for comments he might have. Sorry to put you right in the spot.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our panel and interested parties. I look forward to the testimony and the edification for I will be traveling to Georgia with, I believe, Congressperson Kay Granger and Dreyer to monitor the elections. I am certainly concerned about elections all over the world, including in my home city of Memphis, where they're probably, worse conducted than maybe they are in Georgia and other places. And maybe Georgia is going to be a great experience, and I'll learn something to improve Memphis. But I look forward to observing and participating, and hopefully the people of Georgia will have a free and fair election and elect the person who is indeed the winner of the contest. And with that, I yield back the remainder and just look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Cohen. Before going to our first panelist, I'd like to point out, and would not want to fail to mention, the terrible scandal that broke yesterday in Georgia concerning gross abuses in prison. Videos have emerged that reveal the most horrifying of tortures, including the sadistic rape of men by prison officials. The Georgian Minister of Corrections has resigned, individuals have been arrested, and the government has pledged to punish all those responsible and to uproot this problem. I welcome those actions and promises, but I also would note the statement made by the National Security Advisor, who said, quote, "We as a government made a grave mistake when we did not properly evaluate the signals coming from the Ombudsman and other civil society groups about the systemic problem in the penitentiary system." That is a telling admission. It's precisely the systemic nature of this abuse that evokes the greatest concern, because it raises questions about the nature of Georgia's state's relationship with his citizens. I'd like to now introduce our very distinguished first witness, Thomas Melia, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. He is responsible for DRL's work in Europe, including Russia and Central and South Asia, as well as worker rights issues worldwide. In addition to heading the head of U.S. delegation to several OSCE meetings, he is the U.S. co-chair of the Civil Society Working Group in the U.S.-Russia Bilateral Presidential Commission. Mr. Melia came to DRL in 2010 from Freedom House, where he was Deputy Executive Director for 5 years. He had previously held posts at the National Democratic Institute and the Free Trade Union Institute at the AFL-CIO. He also has a Capitol Hill experience, having served as Senior Legislative Assistant for Foreign Affairs Policy for Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Secretary Melia has just recently returned from a visit to Georgia, so will provide, I think, some very fresh impressions as to what is going on there. Secretary, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Cohen for being here today and for this invitation. Before I get into the Georgia discussion, I just want to say how pleased we are to work on a daily basis with the Commission and the staff in advancing a shared agenda and promoting human rights and democratic values across the OSCE region. I will be going to Warsaw next week for the Human Dimension meeting, and look forward to working with your staff and others there in this regard, as we have so often in the past. In this context of a shared, continued objective of strengthening democracy in the OSCE region, and in advance of Georgia's October 1st parliamentary elections, President Obama, Secretary Clinton, and other senior U.S. officials have highlighted the importance of such a truly democratic electoral process for Georgia in our regular dialogues with the government, in our strategic dialogue, which means high-level meetings here and in Georgia, most recently at the highest level when Secretary Clinton visited Georgia in June. Last week, President Obama and Secretary Clinton sent to Georgia an unusual interagency delegation that I was privileged to lead that included senior officials from the State Department, U.S. Agency for International Development, the Department of Justice, and the Department of Defense to demonstrate that there's a broad interest in these elections in Georgia, just as there's a very broad and deep relationship being built out between the United States and Georgia. Our delegation went to Georgia to highlight the importance of a democratic process that produces a parliament that reflects the will of the Georgian people. I was delighted that our newly arrived ambassador, Richard Norland, who had just been confirmed and arrived, joined most of our meetings in his very first week in country. We met with a range of senior government officials, the Prime Minister and other ministers, Election Commission Chairman, the head of the Special Audit Office, and as well as with political opposition, NGO election observers, journalists, and others. The message that we conveyed privately at each of our meetings was identical and also identical to what we said in public. The United States supports the Georgian people's aspirations for a free and democratic process. We do not favor any particular party or candidates, and the United States looks forward to close cooperation with whichever leaders the Georgian people choose. Conducting these imminent elections with integrity will be critical to helping Georgia advance its Euro-Atlantic aspirations. They will also be essential to a democratic transfer of power next year, as the parliament elected in October will, at the start of the next presidential term, will select a new prime minister who will have enhanced powers under the constitutional revisions that will take place at the end of this president's term, when President Saakashvili's successor takes office. Domestic and international perceptions of fairness of the campaign environment, including adherence to the rule of law, media access and transparency, and the impartial adjudication of election-related disputes, will be important indicators of Georgia's democratic development. I would like to highlight today, as I did in Tbilisi last week, the importance of several fundamental principles that featured in all of our conversations in Georgia, and all of which are essential for a meaningful electoral process. First and foremost is the importance of a level playing field. It is essential that the political environment is conducive to serious participation in the campaign by all the major parties on equal terms. We welcome some steps by the government through the Interagency Task Force on Elections, most conspicuously, to address reports of politically motivated firings. For instance, they issued a statement early in the summer urging all government agencies to discontinue any layoffs until after the election. This for the stated purpose of removing the concern that in downsizings currently underway in the Georgian government, that personnel associated with the political opposition would be disproportionately affected. That had been the concern, that it was people associated with the opposition that were disproportionately losing their jobs as teachers and government employees at all levels. While such reports of politically motivated firings have decreased recently since the IATF announcement, concerns remain regarding the levelness of the playing field, including some alleged harassment of certain activists for their participation in the opposition coalition, some reports of blurred boundaries between state institutions and the ruling party, for example, some public servants using government resources for campaign activities, and the alleged use of administrative resources, particularly outside the capital, such as the use of public service announcements that seem to be for the benefit of the ruling party. Nevertheless, although there have been some shortcomings, it is clear that, largely due to the substantial financial resources that have been available to the main opposition coalition, this is the most competitive election in Georgia's history. The second principle is about rule of law and due process. In our meetings with the Georgian government and the various political parties, we stressed the importance of ensuring that the campaign and election laws are applied equally and transparently, and that all participants are held to the same high standards of conduct as spelled out in Georgian law. While almost every party, including the ruling United National Movement, has been penalized for campaign finance violations, the State Audit Office has devoted the most significant part of its attention to the opposition coalition Georgian Dream. Although there are some anecdotal and circumstantial indications suggesting that Georgian Dream may well have spent substantial amounts of money in violation of the campaign finance laws, the lack of transparency in the State Audit Office's procedures and due process deficiencies raise doubts about whether the law has been enforced equally vis-a-vis all parties. That the recent director and deputy director of that State Audit Office last month became ruling party parliamentary candidates, while the current director of the office is a former member of the ruling party, member of parliament. This exacerbates the concerns about the partisan nature of the investigations being undertaken by the State Audit Office. We recognize the challenges on all sides of complying with and enforcing a new set of campaign finance laws and urged the State Audit Office, we did meet with their new leadership, to emphasize transparency and due process as it continues to improve its work. We urged all the political parties to participate constructively, follow the law scrupulously, and to pursue their political goals through the ballot box. The third principle is respect for fundamental freedoms. Respect for peaceable protests and freedom of assembly is a hallmark of a democratic society, and the government holds a particular responsibility to protect and uphold those freedoms. We heard last week that the political parties we met have generally been able to travel the country, hold rallies, and get their messages out to the voters with whom they meet. In our conversations, we also urged all parties to renounce violence and avoid provocations, especially on election day, election night, during and after the ballot counting, and on the morning after. The fourth principle is equitable access to media. We applaud the electoral reforms enacted late last year that expanded the access of all parties on equal terms to the mass media during the 60-day campaign period. More recently, we were encouraged to see the implementation of the so-called must-carry legislation during the campaign period, and we strongly support its extension through the post-election complaints process and beyond. At present, however, the two nationwide broadcast television networks are distinctly pro-government, Rustavi 2 and Imedi, while two regional stations are mainly pro-opposition or at least consistently critical of the government, Maestro and Kavkazia. Continuing efforts to promote wider access to a diversity of opinions and media outlets would reflect fundamental values that democracies share. The fifth principle that we emphasized in our meetings is constructive engagement. We have every expectation now, based on both the opposition's commitment to us that they reject the use of violence and the government's commitment to us that its security forces will be scrupulously professional, that Election Day and its aftermath can unfold peacefully. We certainly hope this will be the case. After October 1, all parties will need to work together constructively in the new parliament to advance Georgia's democratic and economic development. They should conduct their campaign in that spirit. Finally, we call on all participants to promote an electoral process that the Georgian people may judge as free and fair. We commend the work of the domestic and international observation groups, including principally the OSCE ODIHR mission that is currently in Georgia, to help ensure the election process is transparent and consistent with international standards and reflects the will of the Georgian people. The pre-election situation is dynamic, and we are monitoring developments very closely. Your Commission's attention to the upcoming election is helpful. Again, thank you for holding this hearing. We look forward to continuing to work with the Commission and be glad to answer questions.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for your testimony, and very comprehensive, and for the fine work you and the department are doing. And not the least of which is trying to get both sides to absolutely commit to no violence day of and day after, especially day after, which is what I think we're all most concerned about. So thank you for that. And you do believe those commitments are ironclad as much as they can be?
I believe they told them to us, and we will continue to reinforce the fact that we have all agreed on this.
Let me ask you, you know, that video that did surface about the harsh treatment of inmates. Could you comment on that? I mean, that seems to be a very dark insight that caught a lot of us by surprise, certainly me.
Well, let me make 3 quick points about these videos about mistreatment in the prison system. First is that I haven't seen the videos, but the descriptions I've heard of them are pretty gruesome and horrific, and so we're appalled by them. And our embassy has been engaged with the government and with others there in the hours. It's just been since yesterday that this arose very intensively. Second is that it is not surprising. In our annual human rights report that we published this year about the calendar year 2011, we summarized in the executive summary 3 large problems. The first one is continuing abuse of people incarcerated in Georgian prisons. So this is an ongoing problem. It's been clear to us for a while. We have raised it with the Georgian government, and it has been part of our not only our most recent report, but for the last several years.
But this went beyond even what the report would indicate, right? I mean, it seemed to me
videos always bring a new texture to allegations of abuse, and so it seems even more horrific than we had realized. But let me say that the initial response from the government seems to have been, what's the right word? President Saakashvili has acted quickly, and I think in the right way to change the minister of the prison. Minister overseeing the prisons has been changed this morning. The new minister is the Human Rights Ombudsman, who has a sterling reputation in looking after these issues. He's one of the ones that has raised the problem of conditions in prisons in the past. If he is given the power to clean up the act there, he really is empowered to take steps to improve the conditions of incarceration in Georgia's prisons. This could be one of those moments that, where a horrific incident leads to improvement in a system. The other thing that's interesting is that although there's already been some back and forth between the parties about who's responsible for leaking the video and how real the problem is and so on, it's worth noting that Mr. Ivanishvili, the leader of the opposition, also came out this morning in both a previously scheduled meeting with our ambassador and in a public statement, called for calm among his supporters, calling for them not to turn this into a reason for more public street action in response to, the government's responsibility to maintain the prison system. So I think both President Saakashvili and Mr. Ivanishvili have today stepped up and done the right things, done the responsible things, as responsible people sometimes do in moments of crisis.
Are you convinced one of your main points, obviously, was access to media?
Mm-hmm.
Does the opposition and the government, do they all have close to equal access or equal access?
Well, as I mentioned, there are a number of broadcast networks. There's cable television, there's online news services. It's uneven in its, it has been uneven in its reach around the country. The two main national stations that have the most reach across the country tend to be pro-government, echo the government party's views on things. The principal broadcast stations that are friendly to the opposition, or at least critical of the government, tend to be regional stations and don't have the reach in the country. There's also cable television and other means. The must-carry legislation, which had been urged upon the government and that we had urged that they adopt last spring, they did, so that all the different news providers have access to the cable networks of the others, so that at the moment, up and through Election Day, there is more diversity in the carrying of cable news and political discussion. The point I made in my testimony is that now that it's been established that the basic cable infrastructure can be open to the various political points of view, why stop it on Election Day? Why not continue it at least through the end of the official election process? The official election process, of course, doesn't end on voting day. It ends when the results have been tabulated, when disputes have been resolved, and when the elected officials assume their offices. That's when, the election monitor's guidebooks tell you should conclude your observation. And so we think that since there may likely be protests and complaints on the day after the election, that that process, which is part of the election process, should be accessible to all the viewers in Georgia as well. So we've urged that be carried through, at least through the immediate post-election day period. And more generally, there is a question about whether the legislation that was enacted earlier in this year that facilitated that, which did stipulate that this must-carry period would end on Election Day, whether that means that it must stop on Election Day or whether it could continue if the providers see fit. So we're encouraging the providers to see fit.
Are you satisfied that the mechanism for resolution of disputed ballots is up to, standards that would be universally recognized?
Well, the system on
There
paper
will be disputes, obviously.
is the proper one. We met with the Election Commission chairman, whose prior career has been as a CPA and auditor for major international firms. So he knows about lining up the numbers and tallying them accurately. And he's approached his work, I think, in the spirit of a good CPA. And they've set up systems. And one of the innovations in this election that wasn't as true previously is that they will announce incremental election results as they come in from around the country in real time. And they will post them on their website, and they will make them available on screens that will be in the main hall of the Election Commission building. In those of us who've seen elections in post-communist world over the years, that is one of the best practices, so that and one of the concerns in previous Georgian elections has been a bundling of election results. Prior election chairs had decided to kind of wait, and every hour or two they would post election results, and that led to some suspicions that some finagling might be going on while the results were tabulated but not yet released. So what the chairman has committed to doing, and he says this is part of his publicly announced process, is that it would just be a rolling admissions program where everything will be posted as soon as district level election results come in, and that is the best practice. It can work properly.
Let me just ask you three final questions, and I'll yield to Mr. Cohen. Mr. Ivanishvili's citizenship, when it was revoked and reinstated through Constitution, what was our take on that at the time, and are we satisfied that, was it pressure that caused a reversal? Why did that happen? Secondly, with regards to the Chamber of Audit that targeted the Georgian dream by imposing large fines, are those claims plausible? And finally, do you believe sufficient number